Thanks, Alex. And thanks to Alex and the museum or the Department of Archives for inviting me to come speak to you. And thanks to you for turning out on this beautiful spring day in January and coming inside. I'm very happy to be here. Alex mentioned the first book I did, which was on Madison County, Alabama in the early 19th century. And at the time, I thought I was doing a history of the frontier. I was interested in the trans-Appalachian frontier and the spread of cotton, and I did that book way back in the 1980s. When I was in graduate school, I spent a lot of time here at the archives, so it's a real treat to be back here at the archives and seeing how much it's changed and transformed. I went up to the museum upstairs, and it's just beautiful. It's really, really tremendous. In that first book, as I said, I kind of thought I was doing the frontier, and then I was invited some years ago to do this book on Alabama's frontiers. And I realized that there's so much that I had left out, right? I mean, this book that I just did is, I'll put a picture up of it here, covers 400 years of Alabama history from Hernando de Soto to the removal of the Creek Indians in the 1840s. So one of the things I really learned a lot from scholars that I read and some of the primary sources I used was Native American history, which was something that I was not as well versed in my previous book and my previous research. So it's very nice to be here to be able to talk to you about some aspects of what I learned. Better close this up so I don't spill it all over everything. What I'm going to talk to you about today are two episodes of violence that took place centered around the Creek Indians. The first in 1760, when Creek warriors attacked and killed a number of traders in the Deerskin Trade. And then in 1812, when Creek warriors attacked a number of settlers, both along the Federal Road in Alabama, but also up in western Tennessee. Now, some of these might be familiar to you, but what I'd like to do today is sort of use those two episodes of violence as a window into the changing nature of Alabama's frontier, the South's frontier, and the character of that frontier. They're very, very different episodes, and the reactions and responses to those episodes of violence were very different. And they can tell you a lot about the shifting nature of the Anglo-Indian frontier in the South. So that's kind of my purpose for today, to discuss that. So let me start with this episode in 1760, May 1760, with the Deerskin Trade. Actually, before I do, I'm sorry, let me just kind of point out the regions that I'm covering in my book. You know, it says Alabama's frontiers, but really, because Alabama doesn't exist until really almost the end of the book, I deal with pretty much the entire Southeast. It spills over into Tennessee, Mississippi, certainly Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas. So it's a broad territory that I deal with. And one of the reasons is because of the power and the centrality of the Creek Nation. It's a core part of this frontier throughout this time period. So I'm going to talk about this episode in May 1760 in the Deerskin Trade. I'll say just a tiny bit about the Deerskin Trade. The attacks took place in the series of Upper Creek towns, and 11 traders were killed in all. I'll give you some examples in just a minute. But let me say a little bit about the deerskin trade. Really, for decades, by 1760, the deerskin trade was well established. Ever since the Yamasee War, which took place in 1715 in South Carolina, it's been a relatively peaceful period in the Southeast. And you had a very lucrative deerskin trade following the paths to the lower creek towns and the upper creek towns. Lots and lots of deerskin flowing out of that region to Europe. Great demand for deerskin, and lots of commodities flowing into the creek communities of Georgia and Alabama, what would become Georgia and Alabama. Guns, cloth, and other kinds of consumer commodities. So it had been relatively peaceful and kind of regularized with the traders on pack horses coming into the towns, many of them living in the towns, and moving back and forth between Augusta, primarily Augusta, and the creek towns. In May of 1760, though, the sort of regularity and peacefulness ended. One small group of warriors in Okfuskee, or a little village connected to Okfuskee, was led by a handsome fellow who was the son of a chief, son of a headman, and they attacked a trader named John Ross, a fairly prominent trader, and, quote, chopped him into pieces in a most horrid manner. They killed two of his companions as well. But they did that quickly, quote, without any kind of barbarity. So they killed three in that town. John Ross was known for being kind of a irritating person, so I think they chose to kill him in a more brutal way. The accounts of these murders and these close escapes come from James Adair, who was an Indian trader throughout the Southeast and kept a journal, and so he wrote these accounts of this kind of day in May 1760 and the people who were attacked. John Ross was not so lucky, but his business partner was in the woods at the time when the attackers struck, and he was able to hide from scouting parties, hiding under a fallen tree. His Creek wife came in the middle of the night and tracked him down and gave him supplies, and he basically fled, hiking all the way to Augusta from there, which had to have taken weeks to get to. Another trader in a nearby town was in his storehouse with his Creek wife and was visited by two unarmed Creek men. All three of the men, the trader and the two Creek Indians, were dressed basically similarly in kind of breechcloth and a blanket. He and his wife started to get a little suspicious about these two men who had come to his storehouse, in part because of their, quote, gloomy and fierce expressions. So they were on alert. When one lunged to grab him and another reached for an axe that was lying on the floor, his wife moved quickly and grabbed the axe, shouting to her husband, and Adair probably embellished this a little bit, but she supposedly shouted to her husband, "Husband, fight strong and run off as becomes a good warrior." So he dashed down to the river, escaping, and swam across the river, and eventually made his way to Spanish Pensacola. His wife was unharmed. She knew that she would be protected by her clan and family connections. Another small group of traders, as they started to hear rumors of these attacks happening that day, fled to the town of, and I'm probably butchering this pronunciation, but Mukalasi, who was governed by a headman who was known to the English as Wolf King. He gave them weapons and led them into a hiding place in a nearby swamp, and then eventually, when things had died down, sent them off to Savannah. In all, though, 11 men connected to the deerskin trade were killed that day in May. Now, what's interesting to me, I mean, the attacks are interesting, but what's interesting to me is the response to the attacks. There was no widening of war. There was no repeat of the Yamasee War, which happened back in 1715 and was triggered by attacks on traders. Instead, there was a kind of de-escalation of tension almost immediately. One of the headmen, who was known as the Okfuski captain, immediately sent word to the governor of Georgia, the British governor of Georgia, kind of vouching for his loyalty, saying that his people were always reckoned one people and one fire with the English. And the mad affair, the killings, had threatened to put the fire out, but he hoped it would burn as long as the sun shines and the rivers empty themselves into the sea. So he immediately is sending out messages to the governor. And the governor accepted those peace offers. The governor, despite some anxiety among backcountry settlers, refused to retaliate in any way for the killings of the traders. He accepted the peace offer. One of the men who was involved in the killing, handsome fellow who killed John Ross, a little later, I think some months later, brought a scalp of a Cherokee warrior to Augusta. The Cherokee there had been a recent war between the English and the Cherokee. He brought a Cherokee scalp to Augusta, saying that he hoped it would help restore peace and good understanding with the English and wipe away a few of the tears for the murder of the traders in their nation. So there's this attempt to kind of tamp down tension. The traders who had been killed were treated with respect by the Creek after the murders. They scraped their flesh from their bones, and they bundled up those bones in deerskin that had been bleached white and buried in the ground, which was a respectful way of burial. So what struck me is sort of what can we make of both the outbreak of violence and the response to this? What can it tell us about the frontier at that time? Well, obviously with the violence, there's let me just check something real quick. With the violence, there's obviously some tension there, right? They were killed for a reason. It's not exactly clear, or really very clear at all, why those murders happened when they did to the people that they did. But there were simmering tensions within the deerskin trade. As much as people benefited from it on both sides, the debt that the Native Americans were accruing from the deerskin trade was growing and growing and growing, and traders were often frustrated with that. They were kind of working on the margins, and they had debts back in places like Augusta and Charleston. So they felt certain kinds of pressures that created tensions. Native Americans, the Creek Indians and others, complained about the traders cheating them. So there were tensions around that. So it's not clear exactly why the Creek warriors, those specific Creek warriors, attacked those specific traders on that day. But there were probably some underlying tensions around the deerskin trade. At the same time, though, when we look at why there wasn't much of a response, why there wasn't an escalation of violence, I think certain things stand out. One is the way in which the traders were entwined within the Creek communities, and the kind of mutual dependence between the deerskin traders and the Creek. For example, the role of Creek women as wives to the traders was very, very important. They helped kind of incorporate their husbands as traders within Creek society, and in the case of that one trader, helped protect him from actual death. So that kind of entwining of traders and Creek Indians was important. The fact that some of the headmen, like the Wolf King, protected traders is also important. Headmen often gained political and financial power through their relationship with the traders. They could accumulate goods from the traders and then distribute them within their communities. So the fact that headmen protected some of the traders on that day when the attacks were taking place is an example of the way in which the deerskin trade kind of entwined the English traders, Anglo-American traders, and the Creek. I think that the response to the attacks also sort of highlights the decentralized nature of Creek society. You had headmen who were very quick to say, those weren't my people who attacked those traders. They often would sort of say that it was young, hot-headed warriors who did it, and that they don't really represent the feelings of specific Creek towns. So there was this decentralized nature of Creek society that allowed these sort of peace overtures to unfold immediately after the attack. The other question is why Governor Henry Ellis of Georgia and other officials within the kind of Anglo-American world did not feel a need to retaliate. And here, there's two reasons, one more important than the other. The less important is probably the profit of the deerskin trade. Deerskin trade was very, very profitable, and everybody, wanted to kind of settle the disputes and kind of get back to business. More important, though, I think, was the need for an alliance with the Creek Indians, or at least not antagonizing the Creek Indians to siding with the French. Because what you had in Fort Toulouse and Mobile was a French imperial enemy. Fort Toulouse was a French fort, kind of in the heart of the Upper Creek country. And in 1760, England was at war with France, and there was tremendous anxiety, tremendous concern that the war would come to the South, and that the allies of the French, the potential allies of the French, the Cherokee, the Creek especially, could do great damage to the backcountry settlements of South Carolina and of Georgia especially. So there's this fear of driving the Creek Indians into the arms of the French. The British agent for the Southern Indians, Edmund Atkins, was very aware of the importance of Native Americans to British imperial ambitions. The prosperity of our colonies on the continent will stand or fall with our interest and favor among the Indians. While they are our friends, they are the cheapest and strongest barrier for the protection of our settlements. When enemies, they are capable by ravaging in their method of war, in spite of all we can do to render those possessions almost useless. So this drive to maintain alliances is a big part of why there wasn't this kind of retaliation for the killing of the traitors. And I guess a final reason that I'll mention, and I'll maybe return to this at the end, is that the traitors were, to a certain extent, a kind of disreputable sort. And they didn't necessarily have a lot of clout within the higher levels of Anglo-American society in places like Georgia and the Carolinas. All right, so you had that moment of violence in May of 1760 that was tamped down almost immediately by both sides. Now I'm going to move ahead in time. It's a very famous picture, and it's part of the cover of my book. It's reportedly a picture of Benjamin Hawkins, although that's not completely authenticated. Benjamin Hawkins was the American representative of the federal government, American agent to the Creek Indians. I'm sure you all know a fair amount about him, maybe. He was in charge of kind of implementing American policy among the Creek and promoting the government policy of civilization, what they were trying to do in terms of encouraging men to give up hunting and take up agriculture. The Creek Indians and their ancestors had been practicing agriculture for centuries and centuries and centuries, but they wanted men to give up the hunt and become farmers so that land would be freed up to sell to the Americans for settlement. So he's kind of in charge of that kind of economic transformation and encouraging the economic transformation of the Creek Indians, which you can see with some of these farming implements. And the other thing is he was encouraging kind of the consolidation of the Creek Nation, the centralizing the authority in the National Council. Instead of having a decentralized system of headmen representing individual towns, Hawkins very much believed, and the federal government wanted to only deal with one entity, right? And so they were trying to boost the authority of the National Council of Creek and have them represent the entire Creek Nation, upper and lower towns, and so that when crimes were committed by individual Creek, the whole Creek Nation would respond and punish those criminals. So there's and Creek leaders, to a certain extent, also wanted to nationalize and to create a stronger national council in order to deal with the Americans. They were beginning to think, by the time you get to the turn of the century, the early 1800s, they're beginning to think that a decentralized system meant that their land was being chipped away from them, and that if they could centralize authority, they'd be able to hold on to their territory. So Hawkins represents all of this idea of economic change, of the power of the federal government in negotiating with the Creek Nation, and the centralization of the National Council and political authority. The reality, as you get toward 1812 is the other moment of violence that I want to talk about. And I want to sort of explain some of the pressures that were facing the Creek Indians at that time. One obvious pressure is the encirclement of Creek. So the Creek country here, spilling into Georgia and Alabama, right, is encircled by American settlements in Tennessee, northern Alabama at this time, the Tennessee Valley, certainly Mississippi, down in the Tensaw area. They're encircled by American settlement, and so they're feeling the pressure, and they've lost a fair amount of their land at this point by 1812, especially in Georgia. So their territory is shrinking. They're feeling that pressure. The federal road that was built originally as just a small kind of path was being widened in 1812 to make it a military road that wagons could go down and larger groups of soldiers could go down. So there's cutting through their territory a federal road, which angered a good number of them, settlers pouring along that federal road. At the same time, the federal government was pressuring the Creek to allow transport along the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers and through these river systems that flowed through the Upper Creek towns. And Creeks objected to that, this idea that you would have produce from settlements in Tennessee and North Alabama, Georgia, coming down these rivers through their towns. They felt as though it was an intrusion, a kind of infringement on their autonomy. And so there was pressure and pushback against Hawkins. Hawkins was constantly sort of telling them that it's a done deal, it's going to happen, the federal government's going to make it happen. We need to have the free flow down to the Gulf for the commerce of our settlements, the American settlements surrounding the Creek country, so the Creek Nation. So they're feeling all of this pressure and this kind of challenge to their autonomy. And it's those kinds of pressures that contribute to, not certainly the sole cause, but contribute to the splitting of the Creek Nation into factions, the Red Stick and the White Stick, and that led to the Civil War that then contributed to the Creek War that the Americans were embroiled in 1813-14. So these pressures that were kind of fracturing the Creek Nation is part of the backdrop to these attacks that took place in 1812. 2 travelers along the federal road were killed in the spring of 1812. And more sensationally, a small group of Creek warriors who had traveled north to meet with and visit Tecumseh, who was the leader of a nativist movement that was trying to create a pan-Indian alliance of all the Western Indians to drive out settlers, to push back American encroachment. There were members of Creek society that were allies of his, other Creeks who opposed his ideas and his plans, but this small band of warriors had traveled north up to north of the Ohio River to visit with Tecumseh, and on their way back, they attacked 2 families in western Tennessee along the Duck River. And these 2 families, the Manleighs and the Crawleys, the husbands were away. The husband of the Crawley family and the husband of the Manleigh family were away. So the people who were killed in these attacks were women and children in a very kind of sensationalized way. The reports were very sensationalized. Let me get a quotation here. Excuse me for 1 second. One of the victims, Mrs. Manleigh, survived long enough to be able to tell what happened, and she had been shot in the knee and shot through the jaw and scalped with arrows left in her, but she survived for several hours and said that her newborn baby had been grabbed and smashed against a wall, that her son had tried to run away and was overtaken by Indian dogs, and the Creek warriors had danced around him before killing him. These kinds of very kind of emotional, gruesome sort of descriptions were part of sort of frontier stories about Native American attacks going back to the 1780s, 90s, and so on. But these were printed up in the newspapers at the time and created a lot of anxiety and anger. One of the women, Mrs. Crawley, was kidnapped. She was taken, held captive, and taken down, supposedly down to Tuckabatchee, Native American Creek town. And the Nashville Clarion, a newspaper, printed up a story that reportedly had been told to them by, quote, a half-breed Cherokee, and that said that she had, quote, been severely whipped, exhibited naked in circles of warriors who danced around her, and that at present she is at Tuckabatchee beating meal, like cornmeal, for the families to whom she belongs. So she'd been essentially enslaved, paraded about naked, and so on. Mrs. Crawley was rescued. She was. They figured out where she was, and they negotiated her release. And there's no way of knowing if she had been treated the way that was described in the newspapers. But there was tremendous outrage over these attacks. And there were calls for retaliation. So very different circumstance, very different reaction. And I want to kind of highlight, I want to look at both moments of violence and highlight the distinction between them and sort of pinpoint certain points about it that I think are important to understanding the kind of shifting character of the frontier. First of all, I think the victims. You think about the victims. Traders in 1760 were entering an Indian world, a Creek world. They were facing risks that everybody knew existed. And as I said, they were a somewhat disreputable bunch, and they were men. And it's very, very different, I think, that idea that these were people who had left Anglo-American society and had moved into an Indian world. They faced those risks, and okay, too bad they got killed, but it's not enough to start a war. The settlers are a different matter. As I said, Creek society was at this time encircled, and there was tremendous pressure on them giving up more and more and more of their land. And that pressure came out of settlement and the desire of Americans who were pushing west to find land to settle and raise their families on and make a living and so forth. So settlers, in America's eyes, even though this is Creek territory, it is part of the United States. It's been encircled, it's been absorbed, even though they are autonomous and a distinct nation, they are within the United States. And the power of the federal government was bearing down upon them. So settlers embodied that concept of encirclement. And for the Creek Indians to attack settlers along the federal road, or to attack families, women and children especially, in western Tennessee, was an outrage in a way that the traders' death was not. Okay, so the different character of the traders and the and the settlers, I think, play a role. I think another important point is that in 1760, there was a rupture. These murders were a rupture in an established relationship, trade relationship, that was lucrative and that helped build alliances that were crucial to English ambitions on the continent. And so the incentive was to heal that rupture, to accept headmen saying, oh, it was just these young, hot-headed warriors. We want to rekindle the fire between us. We want to rekindle our relationship. And for Georgia's governor, Henry Ellis, to say that makes sense. So what you had was, in a kind of exchange, you had diplomats, essentially, Creek diplomats and Georgia diplomats, who walked the path between those communities and made peace. In 1812, that did not exist. Instead of diplomats going back and forth trying to make peace, you had angry, outraged letters from Westerners, at this time Westerners, people in Tennessee, Mississippi Territory, who, back to the federal government saying, you have to do something about this. You have to stop this. We need to retaliate. You had angry editorials in newspapers that were calling for retaliation at this time. So it's a very different sort of context. Now, one thing that was similar but played out differently was that one of the things in 1760 that really made the English want to maintain their relationship with the Creeks was their competition with the French and the fact that they were at war with France, right? They did not want that war to come to the South and have the Native Americans be proxies in this war and attacking their settlements. Well, in 1812, the United States was at war with the British. War was looming, and it did not help the Creek Indians. It did not give them any leverage. All it did is raise suspicions among Americans that the Creek Indians would become pawns and allies of the British if the war came down to the Gulf. So the context of war played out very differently in 1760 than it did in 1812. In 1812, it just raised suspicions about the Creek Indians, and the Creek had no benefit from that. They were not particularly allied with the British, and the British weren't in the region yet. Later on, they would be, but it was too late for the Creek. So these contexts were very, very different in the two areas. The final thing is that that the American goal was the acquisition of land. And these murders illustrate the pressures generated within Creek society and the anger generated within Creek society over that policy of trying to acquire more and more and more land. But that acquisition of land heightened tensions after the killing. That desire to acquire land heightened tensions over the killing. I want to show you this quotation that was in the Nashville Clarion in September. This is maybe 5 months after the murders. And it's attributed to Andrew Jackson. It probably was Andrew Jackson, but it's not 100% certain it was Andrew Jackson who wrote this. And he looked ahead to quote, "The moment when all the Southern Indians shall be pushed across the Mississippi, opening the door to the creation of a city, the emporium of a vast commerce flourishing on the spot where some huts inhabited by lawless savages now mark the junction of the Alabama and Tombigbee rivers." It was a favorable moment for accomplishing a part of this great design because the crimes of this Creek nation have supplied us with the pretext for the dismemberment of their country. And that was the response to especially the killing of the Manleigh and Crawley families, in Tennessee especially, and North Alabama. It is time to invade Creek country. They are lawless savages, they have attacked us, and it is time to dismember their country. Now, other events down the road, the emergence of the Creek Civil War soon followed, and the attack on Fort Mims and the Creek War, would dismember the Creek society and Creek nation. The crosshatched lines here, Creek territory that was acquired after the Creek War in 1815 in the Treaty of Fort Jackson. So I think these two incidents, I'm going to give you time to ask questions, but these two incidences, these two moments of violence, I think illustrate the kind of shifting nature from a trading frontier that was built on alliances and the deerskin trade to a frontier that was basically a settler's frontier, that American settler's frontier that created pressures, and violence played out differently in those two different periods. So I'm going to stop here so you have time to ask some questions. I have to catch a plane, so I'm going to have to leave a little bit early. Not early, but just on time. But I wanted to make sure you had my email address. I am happy to, if you have any kinds of questions from this, if you happen to read my book and have questions about that, please feel free to correspond with me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have now. And then when time runs out, if you want to email me, feel free to do that. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
We have microphones. We actually have a number of people who are over in our overflow, so this way they can hear what your question is. So just raise your hand. We have the microphones to pass around.
Thank you for your discussion. I appreciate it very much. The handsome fellow, was he trying to hint that this was Cherokees that was doing this violence, or was that just what kind of a gesture was that? There
were concerns that the killings at that time were connected to a Creek leader called by the English the Mortar, who had an encampment close to the Cherokees. He was farther north and east from the upper towns, and he was very anti-British, and kind of allied to a certain extent with the Cherokees. So yes, there's some anxiety around a Creek-Cherokee alliance, and especially fostered by the French. Everything was English impressions of what was going on in that day are filtered through the fear of the French, and I think they exaggerated the extent to which the French had manipulative power over these Creek. As far as what Handsome Fellow was trying to do, I honestly could not say. I could not say. A lot of what we know comes from the English perceptions of trying to figure out what was going on. But this kind of small-scale targeted killing, it happened periodically in the frontier, and often it was more localized kinds of concerns, not these big imperial kinds of battles. Okay, so I don't have a great answer for you on what Handsome Fellow was thinking in terms of the Cherokee.
Two questions up here. What was the nature of an Indian town, and how many people were in one?
How many people were in them?
In a town, yeah.
Well, they varied. I mean, they varied in size. from hundreds to, gosh, I don't know, maybe 1,000. That might be a little big at this point. And they varied in size. They often had offshoot villages or sort of daughter towns that were affiliated politically with those towns, and they would gather together once a year. But I would say anywhere from the low 100s to maybe up to 800, 900, 1,000 maybe, something like that at this time.
Fort Jackson, is that the same place as the old French fort?
It's almost, yes, it is. In general, it's very close. Yeah.
And Tecumseh, how close can you describe where it's located? Is that Wetumpka?
I might have once known, but I don't know exactly. Does anybody here know? There's some hands that can answer you better than me.
It's in Tallahassee, and they do a very impressive outdoor play of Tecumseh coming to the Creek Nation with Hawkins. It's a very enlightening play that goes right along with what you're saying with the uprising.
Okay. Yeah.
It is located where, if you're familiar with 229 South, this is the person speaking, 229 South out of Tallahassee, between Tallahassee and the interstate, was located where the Sikorsky plant is now, is where Tecumseh was.
Okay. Thank you.
Tecumseh is also, there is a Tecumseh in Otaga County, which is a scout camp.
Okay. Here's a...
Wasn't Benjamin Hawkins' wife was known as the Queen of Tecumseh?
I had not heard that. But...
I said, it was not, it's been mentioned that Benjamin Hawkins' wife was once known as the Queen of Tecumseh.
I didn't know that. He was mostly located in, his Creek agency was in Georgia, but he might have met her and she might have lived with him at that Creek agency. Yeah. But she was from Tecumseh. I didn't know that. Yeah.
You showed a map up there with in approximately equal-sized letters, Fort Toulouse and Savannah. I think it appeared to have been a British map. Does that indicate, as you said, the exaggerated significance of Fort Toulouse? Because obviously there weren't nearly as many people at the fort.
No, the fort was a pitiful little fort.
They were afraid of them.
But yes, it's amazing how much it, going back in the 18th century, how much it annoyed and irritated Carolina officials and then later Georgia officials, because the French were very adept at creating good relations with the Creek Indians through services. For example, they had a full-time blacksmith at the fort that repaired guns. And so Creek Indians who had traded with the English for guns because they liked the British guns better, the English had better trade products. The French couldn't compete for those products, but they could compete with a service contract, basically. And they would repair the guns so that the Creek Indians didn't have to buy new ones from the British. So the fort, even though militarily it was pretty pitiful and small, maintained a presence in that area through the relationship with the people who lived around the fort and in an even wider circle.
It had a big influence. It had a big influence.
Yes, it did. Yeah, especially in the earlier decades. By 1760, less so. But with the war going on, the English didn't want to take any chances.
There was friction between Andrew Jackson and John Sevier, and I wonder if that has anything to do with Andrew Jackson's determination to move the Indians off the land.
It's certainly the competition and the political back and forth between them certainly played a role in, Jackson's rise within Tennessee and his command of troops at various times. I don't remember the details of. I know at some point Sevier blocks his ability to become a commander of the militia for a period of time. So there's all these kind of factions within Tennessee politics that play a role in the trajectory of Andrew Jackson's rise. But he was pretty successful at navigating that because he did rise. And obviously the military conflict with Native Americans played a significant part in his rise as a political leader within Tennessee and then the nation. So.
We have time for one more question.
No?
Or we can also.
No one else has one. There's a sign in Sylacauga that, to the effect that it was, a historical plaque, the fact that it was settled by Shawnee Indians from up north. That sounds accurate, right?
There was the Shawnee. One of the things that has, as I read more and more Native American history when I was working on this book, that has astounded me, is how much mobility there was over the centuries between of Native American groups from place to place. So the Shawnee, there were parts of the Shawnee that lived in kind of central Alabama, and Tecumseh's. It's rumored that Tecumseh's parents had come from that area of Alabama and then moved north of the Ohio River into the Ohio-Indiana region. So there were Shawnee that way back had been in this region.
Were they not considered invaders by the resident tribal people?
No, not necessarily. There was a lot of migration and mobility that sometimes involved warfare, but often not. I think often, and this was my impression before I started learning more of this, is that we tend to think of it being fairly static, that people were where they were, and until the Europeans come in, and then that sort of mixes everything up and everything starts shifting around. But in fact, there was a tremendous amount of mobility, and whole societies kind of shifting and moving into other regions, and often forming cooperative, close relationships and intermarrying and so on. So, yeah.
Join me in thanking Dr. Dupre.
Thank you for coming.